Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Gordon Wiborg, and this is the Gordon Wiborg Show. It's just about 1900, that's 7 o'clock p.m. local or Arizona time, and it's Monday evening, the 8th day of August, 2022. Now, at the beginning of all of these podcasts, this is number 2. At the beginning of each, we're going to go over a pretty simple agenda. The first thing is we'll go over what we did last time. Then we'll go into the focus for this time. Then we'll end up talking about what's coming next time. And of course, any other announcements or current affairs in there that are bearing upon any of us at any time. Even though we're going to be publishing the sequence of podcasts over the next dozen, several dozen, whatever we end up with, we're going to be interrupting and stopping anytime that there's a compelling international or national event that affects some of us or all of us. So please bear in mind that even though we have that schedule, if something happens, for example, last week when the Speaker of the House decided to go to Taiwan for whatever reason, but we'll talk about that too in one of our podcasts, if Taiwan is still there. But that's current events, good or bad. We need to cover that so that you understand what's happening in the world and in your country, especially now we're 92 days from the midterm election. That may seem like a lot, but I'm sure if you're campaigning for one of those seats, it's not at all a long time, because tomorrow's going to come really fast, and then we'll see who comes out on top. So last time we went through the introduction, an introduction to what we're doing here on the show, the podcasts, and an introduction to me a little bit. I have posted my biographical sketch on the Facebook page for the show and invite you to, if you want some light reading, it's only one page. Have a go at it and see what I've done over the past 30 or 40 years. I retired from government service in 2016 with 43 years in government service. That's all in there. It's all broken down as to what I was doing and where I was during that time. So feel free if you want to take a look at it, if you want to pull it and print it, or print it up and throw darts at it, whatever is floats your trigger. I know I'm mixing my metaphors. Then go ahead and do that. So we're going to move on to our next topic, which we kind of talked about last time a little bit, but there are parts of the United States Constitution that all of us get involved with from time to time. How many of you have ever been to court either as a plaintiff or a defendant in a criminal or civil trial, or as an arrestee for an arraignment or initial appearance, or as somebody who just sat in as a member observing, or as someone who served on a jury, or if you're an attorney and you were representing someone else, or yourself. So how many of us have not been to court in any way, shape, or form? Raise your hand if you have. Well, most of us, if not all, have spent a great deal of time in a United States courtroom, either at the local, the county level, the state level, or the federal courts. I myself, of course, as a police officer for 35 years, I ended up showing up in more than 400 court appearances where I was sworn in and said a lot or said very little, did a lot or did very little. Either I was a supervisor of somebody who did something or I did it myself. The point is that you really need to become comfortable with the court, as comfortable as you can, if you're going to have to go to court for something in which you will be impacted by the court's decision. A lot of you are involved in family court, custody of kids, divorce from a spouse. The family court doesn't have the very best reputation right now. One of the reasons for that is that family court goes by some different standards and criteria that the other courts go by. So we're going to be talking about a lot of that here because essentially it's all based in the United States Constitution and the state constitution for whatever state you're in and working in. Remember a little bit about the sequence and the chronology here of everything. The settlers had come into the New World and colonized eventually 12 different colonies along the eastern seaboard, founding the first states of the Union. Many of them had fled the king's realm in England. And the last thing that they wanted was to have to comply in any way, shape, or form with what the English king said. So they've come here. Some had been involved legally with the king, had gotten in trouble doing, one thing or another. One individual actually had fled to the United States after pissing on, I hope I can say that here, after pissing on the king's crown. The only thing I haven't been able to find is whether the crown was on the king's head or not. I presume it wasn't, because the individual was allowed to leave, or at least did leave, and come to the New World. Well, they didn't spend their time here in freedom and away from the English king as they had hoped. Unfortunately, of course, the British, who had managed, really financed and supported the movement of these people to the New World, felt that they were owed something for all of this time and expense that they spent. So many of the settlers, or people that were now living here, at least temporarily, wore red, which was the British Army. By 1776, ding, ding, that date should ring a bell with you. By August 2nd of 1776, the colonists had had enough. They had had their homes ransacked, broken into, had their weapons taken, and we'll get to that in more detail, had their women folk, as they called them, raped and injured or killed. The British Army, for a great deal of the time, was out of control. The British had trouble finding commanders who wanted to come to the New World, and they tried to keep that optional for the commanders. Many of them were saying, well, thanks, but no thanks, I got to go. Look at the time. They finally were able to find some pretty able commanders and ship enough troops over to the New World that the king and his staff believed that they had enough there to control the colonists and life would be grand for the king. Keep in mind that the British were taxing the American colonists even more than anybody has thought about taxing them here. Some of the taxes of the colonists went to 70, 80, 90% of their crop or their cattle, their livestock, or whatever it is that they produced or managed or handled during the year. They had to, in some cases, give up 80 to 90% of that, which was shipped back over the Atlantic Ocean back to the British king. So you can see that there was some real frustration. There was some real anger building up in the colonies. And by 1776, the colonists had been fed up for a while. On August 2nd of 1776, the colonists finished developing and signed a document which would be known as the Declaration of Independence. That one document has been copied, viewed, emailed, you name it, all over the world, really, more times than any other government or formal document of its type has been. The Declaration of Independence at the time was a real finger in the eye to the king. It basically was giving the king the huge middle finger of all of the colonists. Well, of course, the king didn't take that sitting down. Actually, he probably did, but the king ordered his commanders here in what would become the United States to put their thumb down on the colonists and to suppress all things like speech, the opportunity to carry and bear arms. Now, we're going to get to that separately next podcast. I have to make sure that my mouth is synchronized with my words. So, of course, the Revolutionary War is going. For several years, the colonists, starting out in kind of a hit and run, almost a terrorist type of viewpoint, ended up being really competent jungle fighters and would escape and evade and fight through all the wooded areas, mainly in the Northeast. It's important to remember that at the time, the British military wore red and white and ended up marching in rows which they would use to fire and rotate fire upon their targets. Now we laugh at that, we say how stupid it was, and eventually it was an influence and one of the criteria that ended up sinking the British. But our army, of course, at the time was less disciplined, far less trained, and as a bunch of hunters and farmers basically brought their own weapons to the war. But of course, those were weapons that they had been familiar with for 10, 15, 20 years, had used it not only for self-defense, but for small game hunting around their property for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So they knew their weapons really well. And they knew how to shoot. And they knew how to hit targets really well. So the Revolutionary War goes pretty well, based just on the Declaration of Independence. There's a myth out there that the Constitution was written during the Revolutionary War. And that's not true. The Constitution didn't come out and finally get ratified, and let me just read a little bit to you, until 1789. The Congress of the United States met at the city of New York on Wednesday, the 4th of March, 1789. The convention of a number of the states, having at the time of their adopting the Constitution, and expressed a desire in order to prevent misconstruction of abuse of the powers, that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added. Now, we need to know here that one of the reasons that the Constitution didn't happen earlier is that right after the Revolutionary War, and actually they had been planning it during, guys like Ben Franklin and several others, had developed what's called the Articles of Confederation. With the Articles of Confederation, their intent was to put together a country government that would largely leave the citizens alone and only be there if needed. After a few years, they realized that the first Articles of Incorporation they had gave them a government that was far too weak and basically impotent and wasn't able to do anything for them. So instead of going in and doing some pen and ink changes and coming out with a little bit different Articles of Confederation, they got together and said, hey guys, we got to throw the baby out with the bathwater and make sure that we're able to start a whole new country based on the foundation of a constitution. So they started by basically throwing out the Articles of Incorporation that they had, the Articles of Confederation, and to replace that with an entirely new constitution. Be it resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America, in Congress assembled, 2/3 of both houses concurring, that the following articles be proposed to the legislatures of the several states, there were 12 at the time, as amendments to the Constitution of the United States, all or any of which articles, when ratified by 3/4 of the said legislatures, to be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the said Constitution. Via, and it goes on, and I'll go on with it. The Constitution core was written as a basic, now remember the start of the Constitution, that they're coming up with a new and better country. They wanted to do something better than the Articles of Confederation. They wanted to replace the Articles of Confederation completely. They did so by coming out with the Constitution, and right away, at the beginning of it, said that they were going to come up with a better union than they had under the Confederation. Remember that the original Constitution, which included the Preamble and the very first parts of the Constitution, began with, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union," and they meant more perfect than the Articles of Confederation. In order to form a more perfect union, shall, and then there's a series of tasks and objectives that the Founding Fathers put in there that they wanted to make sure the Constitution included. You know, the Constitution is a really well-written document. Even if it weren't a constitution but something else, at the beginning, they establish why they're doing something. They establish the objective for the document. And they go on and explain some of the reasons why they're doing what they're doing. It's fascinating reading. If you haven't read the Constitution, maybe ever, but certainly in a few years, take the time to sit down with it. It's not that long. And read the Constitution. And what we're going to go over here is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which is known as the Bill of Rights. So we'll move on to those amendments and why they were put in place. Now, we're going to go over a bit of a snippet of the Constitution and get into the Bill of Rights. Let me step aside for a moment and answer some questions that I know are out there. Why are we going over the Constitution like it's a class? This is not a class. And if you feel that you're being talked down to, I apologize. That's not where I'm coming from. I read every day people's very sad, very tragic stories about their divorces and child custody and all kinds of things. And I have to tell you, there's a real lack of understanding of the Constitution out there, not only amongst those of us who are on Facebook, but I can tell you that a great proportion of people that I ever arrested over 35 years believed that, first off, I had to read them their rights as soon as I arrested them. And we'll answer that question as we get to the Fifth Amendment. They also believed that a frisk of them was illegal under the Fourth Amendment. We'll answer that question when we get to it. And when we go into booking, what do you think they were looking for? That they have a constitutional right to make a telephone call to whoever. we'll answer that question as well when we get to those sections in the Bill of Rights. In order for us to be successful in court, we have to adopt a legal mindset that uses the proper terminology, it uses the proper references, and when I say in front of a judge and a jury in court, I have a right to whatever it is, I have to make sure that's really a right, and I'm just not making something up out of thin air. I have seen a judge and jury snicker at a new attorney, an attorney in court who tried to show that his client had a right to flee the police. The judge asked the attorney, he was an older judge and he did a lot of teaching in the courtroom. He asked him to look it up and tell him where that right was. Well, of course, it wasn't in the Constitution, and it isn't. The attorney learned a valuable lesson there is make sure that you know what you're talking about, because otherwise the judge and the jury and the opposing counsel will know that you're talking out of your ass. And if you do that, most of us, our brain is a long way from our butt. So if you're talking out of your ass, you're likely not accessing your synapses up here that need to help you communicate more effectively. The point there is that everything we do in court is based on the Constitution. Believe me, I could put an amendment on virtually every conduct or piece of behavior in the courtroom. If we don't know that, if we don't understand the amendments as they are written and interpreted, and we'll talk about the Supreme Court and all of this, then we're in trouble. We've got to understand it. We've got to be able to work with it. And we've got to be able to be comfortable working in the Bill of Rights. Now, does that mean we all have to be attorneys, especially if we are presenting pro se for ourselves, covering for ourselves in a court of law, provided the court of law allows that? We don't have to be attorneys. We don't all have to learn all the law and be able to recite the Constitution and know the federal and state laws and all that. No, you don't need to do that in order to prevail in court. But you do need to have a working knowledge of those parts of the Constitution which bear heavily on your case. It's hard, I know, when you get into court for the first time, you're afraid. I mean, it's the first time I've been in here, I was intimidated. I practically dropped my teeth the first time I got into court, and they were all connected. So, yeah, you've got a big bench up there with a judge behind it who's about 130 years old. You've probably got a jury there, which is the most eclectic, diverse group of individuals you've probably ever seen outside of a circus. And you've got a few rows of spectators in the back, some of whom are there every day, who want to be there and learn from the court. They're not all fools. And then we have to sit at a desk with an attorney who's going to sit there and whisper certain terms to us We have no idea what he's talking about. It's the worst possible experience that we could be in at that point. And to prevail, to win at that point, is almost more a function of luck than anything else, because I didn't do the work to prepare myself to be in court. I put all of my trust in this attorney, and you know, the young man or woman who's defending you or representing you may be the best attorney in the world. They have high ethics, they're honest, they're well groomed, they take care of themselves, they know the judge, they seem to go smoothly in court. That's great, that's wonderful. But there is nobody in the world more interested in your case and the result of your case, the outcome of that court appearance. There's no one in the world more concerned with that than you. You're the one who's there. You're the one who needs to present certain things to your attorney or to the judge and the jury. You're the one who has to be responsible for a certain threshold of actions and behavior, so that at least when you sit there and your attorney turns and says he's going to have an arraignment that's going to interrupt our hearing, and you're going to sit there, and if you don't know what he's talking about, if you don't know what an arraignment is, if you don't understand this hearing, you're going to be lost. Getting lost in a courtroom is a very, very bad thing. And those of you who have been there know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, let's talk about, as we get into the amendments here, what's the role of the Supreme Court? I'm not going to try to give you a quick civics lesson here, but we need to refresh the three branches of government and their functions. We have the executive branch, which is the president, the White House, the cabinet members, all of his appointees. And under the executive branch is the military. All militaries fall under the executive branch. So that's one branch. Secondly, you have a branch which is the Congress of the United States. So that's a House of Representatives with, I believe, 435 sitting representatives from all 50 states. And at the other end of the building, down a long hallway, you've got the Senate. That's 2 senators per state to give you 100 senators who are the upper house of the Congress, or the upper chamber. The House of Representatives are the lower chamber, or the lower house, if you think of it that way. Sequentially and by regulation, the House of Representatives is supposed to come up with a bill, vote on it after they've washed through it, figured out how they want it to say, send it down the hallway to the Senate. If the Senate agrees with the bill completely, they'll say aye and send it on to the president for his signature. If the Senate goes, whoa, wait a minute, I have questions about this part, then they can start several processes of committee work between the House and the Senate to resolve the differences in the bill. Come up with what in effect is a compromise between the two, and then each chamber has to vote again on the measure so that they're voting on the exact same thing as the other chamber. Once they've come to a solution there, that goes back to the House and Senate. They vote on it. And if it's passed, then it goes to the president to be signed. A law passed by the House and Senate in that way does not become effective until the president has signed off on that law. And you see that oftentimes with a half circle behind the president of cabinet members, senators, representatives, likely the people who were heavily involved in getting this law complete and signed. Now that's in a perfect world and a perfect system. We ain't got it. There are times where the Senate comes up with a bill and sends it to the House of Representatives. It's not the smooth way it's supposed to happen, but by this time we've kind of adopted the idea that whatever works. If one chamber gets something passed and the other one will go with it, that's great. Then you can have a law that gets passed and signed by the president. That's two branches. We've got the executive branch. We have the Congress of the United States branch. And there's a third branch, which is the Supreme Court of the United States. Each of these three branches are, by the Constitution, independent of the others. The only connection there, and it's a thin one, is that the White House nominates members of the judiciary to be on the Supreme Court. The Congress, the Senate, that is, has to ratify that nomination and vote on it, agree on it. And then the individual, just as three have in the past couple of years, then goes on to work with the Supreme Court. That nomination, that appointment by the president to the Supreme Court is a lifetime appointment. By Constitution and law, they want to give the members of the Supreme Court as much distance and independence from the other branches of government so that they're able to hear and work on and adjudicate cases that come to them as objectively, as plainly, as independently as possible. There's only one job that the Supreme Court has under the Constitution, and that is to interpret the Constitution of the United States. The Founding Fathers weren't dumb. They knew that the day would come when they were going to be gone. And they did two things that was really forward-thinking, forward-looking, knowing that 50 years, 100 years, 200 years in the future, the same document would be there, but the wording would be different from what people speak in that day. The grammar is very different. And there was one of two ways that they had to try to interpret that the best they could for those people that weren't of their time. It's easy. They pass the Constitution and a case comes up and somebody needs to know what the Constitution means. Well, it's easy if everybody's still around and they can do what they need to do to answer the question. But 200 years in the future, that's a different ballgame. Now you have a court that has no connection to the constitutional conventions or the final ratification of the Bill of Rights in 1791. It's now 2022. There's nobody from that time who's still alive. So they left two things for us. One was the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court, and really all the federal courts, have the power and obligation to interpret the Constitution for the current environment and day that they're adjudicating that case. For example, let's see that you have a case coming up on the First Amendment. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Now that's a mouthful. There are several clauses in there that have spun off hundreds and probably thousands of court cases at the federal level before this. We have a recent case, which I suspect many of you have been following, that just came up with a final verdict on Friday of last week, awarding the family of, I believe it was a 6-year-old boy at Sandy Hook, that our friend Alex, on his radio show, had been dissing the reality of Sandy Hook and putting out that he believed it was fake. It was a hoax. It was something that people built up and built into it to give people the impression that something horrible had happened, but it had not. Now, Alex is giving this out on the airwaves to anybody who listens. Now, I have to admit to you, I have never watched or listened to the man. I've heard some excerpts here and there. I believe he's got a reputation as a far-right extremist who believes in the Constitution, word for word, letter for letter, including the First Amendment, freedom of speech. There was a family, probably more than one, that was very badly damaged by his speech. And they sued him in civil court. Now, we're going to step aside for a moment because I've heard people say Alex was found guilty of defamation of character or slander or whatever by a jury on Friday. He's guilty. No, he's not. He is not guilty of anything. Let me explain. A few minutes ago, I said that if you're going to deal successfully in a court of law, you need to understand some basic legal terminology. Because at that point, at that level in the courts, it matters. When we're out on the street talking about things, and I say, well, I think that's a postal employee, and my friend says, no, that's stupid, it's UPS, and we argue about that, who cares? One way or another, nobody's going to get hurt, nobody's going to get injured, unless I decide to beat the crap out of him, pick up my cane. His wheelchair is slower than mine, so I can beat him. No, that doesn't happen, and I wouldn't do that. And if I did, I certainly wouldn't tell all of you. You've got to use the proper terminology, or you're going to lose your case. If you go up before a judge and for example, say that Alex was found guilty, now you've told the judge, Your Honor, I'm stupid. I'm lazy. I'm complacent. It doesn't matter to me that I'm using the wrong terminology in the wrong court, in the wrong level, for the wrong purpose. All of which will at least impugn your credibility with that court. Be it a judge or a judge and jury, your credibility just went from reasonably 0 to about -10. And those are going to be hard points to make up. Why wasn't Alex found guilty? Well, didn't they come out and said that he had done these things? That he was responsible for it and has to pay a god-awful somewhere around 50, that's 50, $50 million to this family? More or less, yes. Well, then he's guilty, I'm told. No, he's not. The term guilty only applies in criminal court. In civil court, the corollary to that is called found liable. Now, you may say, well, who gives a rat's ass? Yeah, they're both the same. No, they're really very different. And you need to care about using the right terminology because they will care. Both parties to that decision will care because it matters whether they get their money or not. And to the judge and jury, it's going to matter a great deal. If you don't know what you're talking about in court, the judge is going to be thinking to him or herself, Your Honor, this person is an idiot. Right before me, I have seen their brain fall out on my courtroom floor, and they're babbling something about criminal action in my civil courtroom. I think they're an idiot. At the very least, there goes your credibility. At the worst, that may very well lose your case. Now you say, well, that's not fair. You'd lose a case just because you used the wrong word? Yep. That's the way it is. Now we can sit here and argue all night that shouldn't be that way. I won't argue with that because it is that way. Why is it that way? Let's talk real quick when we start our next podcast about the difference between criminal and civil, how different they are, why they are, And what makes a law a crime? And let me ask you a question I want you to answer in the comments. And I've asked a lot of them tonight, but I'm going to ask just one that I want your answer for. How do you determine that a law passed by a legislature and signed by the governor of the state or by the president of the United States, how do you know if that law is a crime or not? How do you know that if I break that law, I have committed a crime? Well, aren't they all? How do you know? There are ways of knowing. You need to understand that. Ladies and gentlemen, next time we'll pick up with the First Amendment. We'll finish that up. We'll talk about the difference between civil and criminal law and some of the terminology there that can save your ass or get you in trouble in court. I'd much rather help you to prevail in court, to be successful in court, than to lose your ass for a stupid reason like you used the wrong terminology. I will just end with a caveat to that. Most judges and attorneys are pretty understanding and pretty forgiving. Juries, not necessarily so much. Juries are fickle, and you don't know how they're going to react to things. I usually tell people, if you're guilty, pick a jury, because that jury may very well let you off. If you're not guilty, pick a judge, because you want somebody who's learned in the law and is going to give you all the opportunity and breaks that the law offers. The jury has no idea. The judge does. We'll pick up there in our next podcast. That'll be number 3. And I wish you a very good night and a good day and a good week. From my family to yours, stay safe.